Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm Curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon, and welcome to another one of our Cromwellian Conversations. Our job is to try and tell the story of Oliver Cromwell, one of the most famous people in British history, but also one of the most controversial. And our job is to try and tell that story, warts and all. One of the most controversial aspects of Cromwell's career, probably if not the most controversial, is his infamous campaign in Ireland in 1649, something which has made his name go down in infamy in Irish history, made him one of the most reviled characters in Ireland even today. What we want to do with a series of videos over the next few months is interview various historians, academics and experts about their take on this particular aspect of Cromwell's career. And we're starting this time with Professor John Morrill. John is a Professor of British and Irish History at the University of Cambridge. He's one of the world experts on Oliver Cromwell, and indeed is the recent editor of the new 3-volume edition of Cromwell's Letters and Speeches. So he's extremely well placed to give us a viewpoint on what happened in 1649, the reasons for it, and of course what happened afterwards. I hope you enjoy this video, hope you find it interesting, and please do look out for other videos that are going to follow on this topic in the next few months.
John, thank you so much for coming and having a chat today about this. I wanted to talk to you about, get your views and your expertise on probably the most, well, undoubtedly the most controversial aspect of Cromwell's career, which of course is his infamous campaign in Ireland in 1649, and all that sort of spills through related to that. It's something that obviously a lot of people are aware of, and it's obviously an element which a lot of people are concerned about even today, and of course has damned his memory and his name in Ireland even to this day. Just starting off with a bit of context behind this, sort of just for those people who aren't necessarily as aware of the background to it, sort of what's the context to why Cromwell is sent to Ireland in the first place?
Well, in 1641, the Irish population, and particularly the native Irish population of Ireland, had risen up against oppression which they'd experienced. They were being oppressed because they previously rebelled, and they rebelled because they'd been oppressed. So let's not take sides. This is a conflict which has been going on for a very long time, in which there have been significant atrocities on both sides. But in 1641 there was an uprising which begins in Ulster in the north and then spreads to all 32 counties, in which very large numbers of Protestants are massacred. There are some counter massacres, but overwhelmingly at this stage it's Catholics killing Protestants. Now we have no idea of the exact number, and the real expert on this, the late Aidan Clark, always hated any attempt at getting to put a number on it. I'm not quite as bad as that, but I would think 10,000 would be a reasonable estimate. Now, a very large number of those die of exposure because they are literally stripped of everything, including their clothes, and driven off in the middle of the winter. And I think they die as a consequence of that. The number who are stabbed or shot or clubbed is probably much less than that, but nonetheless, something like 10,000, perhaps 1 in 5 of the Protestant settler population is killed. In order to deal with that because it was urgently required, Parliament back in England, with the agreement of the King, agreed to borrow £1 million for an expeditionary force to protect the survivors. And in order to raise that £1 million, they borrow it against a pledge that 25% of the land of Ireland will be confiscated and redistributed to the investors.
This is following the policy of transplantation that's already been taking place since the
Well, there have been piecemeal, but now you're going to actually do it on a vast scale. And so from 1642 onwards, the English Parliament is pledged to confiscate 25% of the land of Ireland. To compensate the people who were not only very important of themselves, but by 1649 they're also the main credit, people give credit to the government. So they're beginning to tighten their purse strings. If you want to get more money from us, you've got to settle with us for all that money we lent you for the Irish campaign back in 1641. So Cromwell is sent to Ireland to restore English rule, to avenge the killings and to confiscate a quarter of the land of Ireland. In the event, although huge amounts of taxation were raised to support his campaign, the campaign was so long-lasting and costly, they had to confiscate 46% of the land of Ireland and redistribute it. So there are two issues here. One is the nature of the actual military campaigns, and secondly, the land settlement, in which the proportion of land in Ireland owned by people born in Ireland dropped from 60% to 15%.
It's a horrific and astonishing statistics, isn't it? And it's almost, it's delivering on that financial promise. It's almost today like we call a kind of PFI contract in a way, really, that they're using to finance this. Cromwell, of course, he spends quite a lot of time preparing to go out beforehand, doesn't he? He's very aware of the fact that, it's been the graveyard of English military campaigns in the past and the graveyard of military reputations beforehand. So he's very careful in his preparations before he goes.
In interesting ways. I mean, he sees his real enemies as royalists rather than Catholics. Now that might seem very surprising, but that is the case. Because as well as facing the Catholic population, he also has to face all the royalist population, who are the descendants of the English settlers from the 12th and 13th century, what the so-called Old English. People like the Marquis of Ormond, or the Earl of Ormond, who's the King's Lord Lieutenant. So in planning his campaign, Cromwell thinks, who are the people I can make a deal with? And the people he can make a deal with to limit the scale of his operation are the most militantly Catholic, because the more Catholic you are, the less royalist you are.
Because he was taking advantage away, because whilst obviously the civil wars are going on in England, Scotland and Wales, there's the Confederate Wars in Ireland, and there are shifting loyalties between these different communities.
And in fact, often the people who are opposed to the English are fighting one another. I mean, but nonetheless, something like 80% of the land of Ireland is under control of the Royalists, who are a coalition of Old English and native Irish, and he makes deals with Randall and MacDonald, who has a small navy, and that navy, if it had been used to harry his supply line, would have been a real pain. By making a deal with him, giving him a pardon, he actually uses that fleet to help his supply chain. But also, even more dramatically, the most militant of the Catholic generals, Owen Roe O'Neill, Cromwell does a deal, or he allows a deal to be made with him through his key ally, George Monk. He has a deal struck with O'Neill, and he actually gives O'Neill support to take on the Scots, because the Scots, although very Protestant, Presbyterian, are pro-Charles II. So there's some very strange things going on. And it's really important to see that Cromwell is dividing and ruling, but he's dividing in a way in which he identifies his real enemies as being the more royalist you are, the more he's against you, the more Catholic you are, the more he might be able to make a deal with you. And that's important when we come to look at what happens during his campaigns.
So this sort of plays into, the perception of, in the popular imagination, is that Cromwell is dramatically anti-Catholic, as indeed, of course, the perception is that most Englishmen of his time were. What is his attitude towards Catholicism? Is it more complex than that?
It is a lot more complex than that, because he does accept that the massacres of Protestants 10 years earlier had been done almost exclusively by Catholics. In fact, the rebels of 1642 morph into the Confederation that is exclusively Catholic. You have to be Catholic to be a member of it. So he is determined to take full vengeance on all those who can be implicated in any of the massacres of 1641 to 42. But those who simply fought in the wars that followed were fighting in a kind of legitimate war, and they will be treated in the same way that royalists in England were treated, and that includes Catholics. He is violently anti-clerical, and he hates the Catholic clergy, who he thinks have caused a great deal of the trouble. But he tells the Catholic population, and he means it, he will not force them to be Protestants. He's not going to convert them. He's going to prevent them publicly worshipping as Catholics, but he's not going to stop them privately worshipping as Catholics. He can't get inside their consciences. So he's saying, you have nothing to fear from me in terms of compulsion of conscience. But if you, for that number who were active as rebels in committing atrocities, then you can expect no mercy. But shall we move on perhaps to what happens at Drogheda?
Yes, so I mean, he arrives in Ireland. I mean, he's geared up for a full military campaign to fight Orme, but he kind of finds that half the job's been done for him by Michael Jones already.
He's very fortunate in that about a fortnight before he arrives, that Michael Jones, who himself had begun the war as not on the parliamentarian side, but on the royalist side, but then changed sides. That Michael Jones, the bishop, the son of one of the Protestant bishops in Ireland, therefore not a Puritan, had won a great victory over Orme at the Battle of Rathmines, just outside Dublin, and that got rid of the marching army of the Royalists or the Ormondists. So what he's really faced by the thought of dozens of sieges of strongly defended towns.
Which is a man who is a cavalry commander can't have been the most exciting prospect. You know, he was never a big fan of sieges, was he?
No, and he always preferred to make generous offers. I mean, one of the interesting things about him before he comes to Ireland is that he had frequently negotiated terms of surrender, which gave everybody inside the town preferential terms of settlements. Because obviously, active royalists, armed royalists, always had to pay very heavy fines for having been active royalists. But all kinds of special deals were struck at towns like Exeter and Oxford. Parliament doesn't like the fact the army is giving special deals. And Parliament is inclined to overrule what the generals had promised. And Cromwell is absolutely adamant that they have made a decision to save lives and to shorten the war, and those terms must be honoured. And he's going to take exactly the same attitude in Ireland. And it's going to cause a lot of problems when it comes to the land settlement, because so many people who'd surrendered on generous terms are looking to him for protection against the full weight of the settlement, and they get that support.
So, having sort of been relegated to sort of doing siege warfare for the next few months, obviously, then we come to the knotty question of Drogheda, which obviously is his first target. Yeah. So his policy is very clear to him. He will arrive at a town, he will summons it, and he'll offer generous terms. Much more generous than they could normally expect. If they accepted, it was crucial to him that he would then honour those terms so that others would see that. Yeah. But equally, if they didn't surrender, they could expect no mercy. And under the international laws of war at the time, that is the case. You're given a chance to surrender. If you refuse it, your lives are at his mercy. It doesn't mean to say he will kill you, but he can kill you. And that's very important. That's a very important distinction. So yes, he comes to Drogheda. It's important that none of the defenders of Drogheda were Catholic Confederates. They were Ormondist or English. There were a lot of English troops who at the end of the Civil War had come over to fight for the Royalist cause in Ireland, and the commander is an Englishman. That's Arthur Aston with his wooden leg. Famously beaten to death with his wooden leg. And two of the other senior officers were English. So we don't know what proportion the men are, but it is an essentially royalist garrison rather than a Catholic garrison, and it's certainly not an Irish garrison. Is it sort of the similar mentality, because obviously during the First Civil War in England and Wales there have been this sort of there have been sort of certain understandings, but in the Second Civil War it starts to get much more brutal. Is it starting to carry on that sort of mentality, as it were, that the parliamentarians are losing patience with people who they see for kind of not only stringing the war on, but also kind of going against God's judgment, as they say.
I think that is absolutely right. The First Civil War was, in a sense, a battle in which God would give victory to those with the righteous cause. But of course, both sides thought that God was on their side. But once God had delivered his judgment, once the king had lost, then to try to restart the war was to go against God's judgment. So it was sacrilege.
Yeah.
So that throughout the Second Civil War, at the end of all the major engagements, the leading royalists are tried and shot. At Pembroke, at
Siege of Colchester.
Siege of Colchester, most obviously, but not only there. So that maybe the same is happening in Ireland. But he's not going to routinely execute the leaders because, and famously, at Clonmel, which was his last engagement, where he lost a huge number of men, and then accepted surrender on incredibly generous terms. He was not willing to execute the man who had done so much damage to him. He's bound by his word, and he always calculated what is the best way to shorten this war. And after all, although we talk rightly about the moral ambiguity, at the very least, of Drogheda and Wexford, there is only Drogheda and Wexford. It isn't ever done again. It isn't done again, partly because after having held out as long as they dare, everywhere does surrender. And secondly, because when he does have to face the thought of doing another massacre, he prefers to give even more generous terms in order to prevent having to do it. So it's not a black and white story. I'm not for a minute going to deny that what happened at Drogheda had never happened in England. It happened, of course, on the continent, but he is fighting by different rules in Ireland from in England, but his circumstances made him feel that was the only way of doing it. And I think the fact that he was in Ireland where there had been atrocities probably hardens his attitude, as well as the fact his long experience of wading through blood had already coarsened his attitude.
So thinking about it from the point of view of returning back to the sort of the issue of Drogheda, talk us through sort of what actually happens there.
Well, of course, the sources are not straightforward, and
so surprise,
and therefore there is no definitive answer. I'll tell you what I am confident. My reading evidence seems to me to indicate the following: that after the refusal of surrender terms, he storms the town. He's rebuffed on the first attack, and there's people who he knows and relies are killed, and he then orders no quarter. He says that no quarter is to be given. They go back in with him in the lead, in fact. He's confident God will protect him, which of course he does. So he storms in, and he storms through the town, and in the course of that storm, in the first few hours, probably as many as 2,000 people are killed. Now, when you're clearing it house by house and street by street, you don't stop and ask whether someone's a soldier or civilian. Many civilians get killed.
It's the awful term that's used today, military technology, collateral damage.
I think there are those that try to deny that, but actually the evidence is overwhelming that people were killed in hot blood. A significant number then hold themselves up in the medieval turrets and in churches, and their position was pretty hopeless. And so then after over the next 2 days or so, they surrender. And his attitude on surrender is to execute all the officers, any priests that were there, or friars, and then to do what the Romans had done, which was to execute 1 in 10 of the common soldiers.
So it's the process of decimation.
By decimation, and almost certainly by getting those by drawing lots. And the 9 who draw the lucky lot, as it were, then responsible for killing the 10th.
Which just doesn't bear thinking about.
And Cromwell uses the phrase in his letter, they were knocked on the head, which would suggest to me that they weren't shot, but that they were given, the 9 were given clubs and told to club their colleagues to death. Okay. And they're killed in Cobra, and then they're sent off, not as some have said, as slaves, but sent as indentured servants.
So that's for a limited period of
7
time.
years. 7 years. And the records in Barbados, show that many of them died as quite wealthy men, but they did do 7 years of indentured service. But an indentured servant is not a slave.
You're protected by law, you still have a right to life, you are no property.
Exactly. But nonetheless, they're sent to Barbados or to Virginia or wherever. Yeah. The worst incident, I think, happened at the Mill Mount, which is a motte with a strong battlements on it, in which Sir Arthur Aston was with his men, and Aston realised it was hopeless, and if he would have indeed have cost a lot of men to storm up there with a very steep-sided mound. But everyone would have been killed, and so he thinks he will surrender, and he asks the man who's in charge of that particular part of the campaign whether or not he can have quarter. And looking at the difficulty of taking the place, he is given quarter. Cromwell then hears the quarter's been granted and said a junior officer cannot go against a senior officer's command. Kill them all. So the officer who'd given the quarter in good faith was overruled, and it was pretty hard luck on Aston that he couldn't trust the word. Ireton is absolutely furious. Ireton, who is Cromwell's son-in-law and de facto number 2, and subsequently, when a similar thing happens during the siege of Limerick, he has the senior officer cashiered for overruling a junior officer who'd given quarter, and published a pamphlet explaining exactly why he'd done it, and that has to be a direct criticism of Cromwell. And my own personal view is that Cromwell and Ireton's relationship was poor by the time they got to Ireland, and it got even worse during his time in Ireland. It's very significant that Cromwell doesn't give Ireton any important jobs to do while in Ireland. He appoints other people as his official deputy. And when he goes out on campaign in 1650, he divides the troops into 3 sections, one headed by a very recent convert from the Orme camp, one Reynolds, who'd been actually a leading leveller in 1647, was a rising star in the army, and Cromwell himself, and Ireton was simply put in charge of the reserves. So I think there'd been already there were the disagreements about what happened at the time of the regicide, not what happened, but the sequence of events. And I think their relationship deteriorated and reached a real low point over this episode at Drogheda. So even at the time, what Cromwell was doing, I think, was deeply controversial.
Do you think he ever came to regret it? Do we have any evidence of that in his letters?
No. His attitude throughout the 1650s is that he must honour all, that there must be all the peace terms that were made, which gave people guarantees of their rights, should be honoured, and he intervened a good deal on behalf of Catholics who petitioned him and who made a case for saying that they had been mistreated. One of the most interesting documents to have emerged in recent years is the court-martial records from Dublin, from the period just as he leaves and on for a little bit afterwards, which show that actually how even-handed the court-martials were, both in acquitting Catholics and also of severely punishing soldiers who stole from the local population or mistreated local population. Now, it's true that Catholics who were found guilty were usually hanged, and that soldiers were usually whipped or made to ride the wooden horse, which is not a pleasant experience which we don't need to go into, but let's say it's extremely painful. But the fact that he could oversee a system that is so even-handed is very striking. And when if we come to land settlement to talk about that, there are more evidence of that then.
So moving on from Drogheda, he then goes on to lay siege to Wexford next, which also falls with blood loss, although most historians sort of tend to suggest that Cromwell was less responsible for that he kind of almost lost control of his men.
Yes, he lost control. He was wanting to use his winter quarters, and it was so completely savage. That was a case of a governor who strung out negotiations, strung them out, was going to surrender, but was trying to hold out as long as he could, to slow down the victory march, as it were. And then one of his peripheral commanders surrendered it and gave the Cromwellians a chance to storm into the town through an unprotected southern entrance, and that they took advantage of that, and then the troops just completely ran amok. And I think the fact that there isn't anything like a detailed account, he's pretty ashamed of what happened there, and he'd lost control of his men. And after that, there isn't another episode. I mean, it did have the effect of making the defenders of other towns think long and hard about how long they were going to hold out before they surrendered.
I mean, it seems to be a factor with, throughout sort of history in the sort of the early modern period, whenever towns are stormed, that the troops tend to go on the rampage thereafter, which you can imagine, sort of with the stress of having to go through and the risks involved, they kind of almost regard it as their reward that, they're allowed to basically free rein thereafter. And
there were atrocity stories which are specific to Wexford. There were stories of parliamentarian prisoners having been starved to death in a chapel, and of also being drowned in a ferry that was deliberately sunk. So there were additional reasons for feeling that this was a particularly wicked town and a particularly wicked place.
Cromwell then goes on, is it 28 more towns thereabouts that he takes, and most of those pretty much without a shot being fired, isn't it?
Yeah. He's very busy buying off people who are reading the signs of the times. There are a lot of the Protestant settlers from the early decades of the 17th century down in the south, in the Cork area, who are now thinking that the future lies much more with Cromwell than with the king. And so he is making it very easy for them to change sides without any penalty, and in appointing some of them to quite senior commands. One of the Boyle family, the Earl of Cork's sons, Lord Broghill or Lord Broyle, there's no agreement even how to pronounce his name, but I say Broghill, I think. Anyway, Lord Broghill, he becomes, as it were, a very senior commander in the south, and it's an example that if you come over in good time, you'll pay no penalties at all. And so he's busy again. He's been buying off the most Catholic. He's now buying off, as it were, the most wary of the Protestants, and building this broad coalition against an enemy that is increasingly seeing that where's it going to get its supplies from, where it's going to get to need pay for its troops from, what are the prospects of the new king being able to raise armies on the continent to come to rescue them, particularly because the stories are spreading that king is now going to just sell them out and make a deal with the Presbyterian Scots, which of course he was doing. And so it becomes easier and easier. There are the places in the west, Limerick and Galway, which hold on for a very long time after Oliver goes back, and slightly reluctantly has his son-in-law Henry Ireton left as his replacement as Lord Deputy.
Because he's only there really for 9 months, isn't he? And I mean, sort of he's recalled because obviously, as you say, things are kind of kicking off with the Scots and so on. His sort of last hurrah is Clonmel, as you say, which is he's sort of the biggest loss of life, I think, the new model armour he suffered in, or biggest blood he knows he'd ever suffered, about 3,000 men in one night.
That's right, they were lured into a trap. But he honours, and then in fact, having won the victory, as it were, the commander withdraws and just leaves a skeleton group to negotiate a very generous settlement, and then Cromwell finds he's been duped because they're not there, and they've slipped away in the night, and he won't chase them, and he won't he won't. He said, well, you know, they've tricked me, but good on them, you know.
After Cromwell's departure, Ireton first and then Fleetwood takes over as the sort of carrying on the campaign. I mean, does it sort of get more increasingly unpleasant as time goes on, do you think? Or
what happens is that huge numbers of defeats. What would normally happen at the end of a siege is the soldiers would be allowed to march away with their small arms.
Yeah.
And they leave their artillery behind, but they take their small arms with them.
leave with the honours of war, I think.
There is in Ireland what are known as the bogs and the woods. And these people took to the bogs and the woods, and they became what are known as the Tories, and something which took another
different word entirely. Yes.
No, it's the same word. I mean,
it's
from there, but they become brigands. They become there's just thousands and thousands of them. It means movement for anything more than significant bodies of men. They're going to be picked on and wiped out. So you've got a guerrilla war on your hands, and that obviously makes for a much dirtier kind of campaigning. And I don't think Cromwell is always saying in his letters, it's very important to realise whenever he writes a letter, all his letters, so I should say, almost all his letters from Ireland only survive because they were printed, because he was writing to politicians in London and they were printing them. An important rhetoric of those letters is always, this is a very difficult war to win, I need more resources.
Yeah.
Now, when Ireton's in charge, Ireton is writing him letters saying, this is a very difficult war to win, I need more resources. And Cromwell knew that you never understated the problem. So I think Cromwell underestimated the problems that Ireton and Fleetwood were facing. And because he already, I think, distrusted Ireton, I mean, he really didn't give him credit for his bleating on about how difficult things were with the Tories. He thought he was exaggerating the problem. And Ireton was already developing a policy which was very different from Oliver's, which you see fully developed at Waterford, that he brought over a lot of volunteers from England, demobbed new model soldiers. If you clear this area, you get to own it. You can you can kill whoever you want, you can drive everybody else out, and then you settle it and you bring in people to work the land with you. You clear. And that becomes, the Waterford experiment becomes the basis for the radical solution, which is ethnic cleansing. It's clearing the whole. You know, in the extreme view, that 28 of the 32 counties of Ireland would be cleared of Catholics. They'd all be either given free passage to the continent, they'd be sent if they'd been guilty of offences, they would be sent across the Atlantic. So something like 30,000 are given, former combatants are given free passage with their families to the continent. Another 30,000 are sent as indentured servants to America. And the rest would be herded into the 4 counties of the West, the famous to Hell or Connaught policy. Yeah. And Connaught in the West. And of course, you know, I can't remember which order he says it in, but the great thing that Edmund Ludlow, who'd become a senior commander, when he saw the county clerk, who's one of the 4 counties, he shook his head and said, here is a place where there isn't enough soil to bury a man, there isn't enough cover to hang a man, there aren't enough trees to hang a man, and there isn't enough water to drown a man. And so this is desperately poor quality land, and therefore it never happened and was never going to happen. There is mass confiscation of land ownership, but in the end, the people who receive the land have got to work the land, and they don't want to do it themselves, and it's much easier to use local native labour. And so there's this 2-tier Ireland in the south, in which you get the descendants of the Cromwellian conquerors who own the land, and a native population that work it, whereas in the north, there had already been, in the early 17th century, clearances. So you get, but the idea that you were to remove every single labourer, tenant, farmer and landowner and send them to the four counties, that was never going to happen, I don't think.
So the ethnic cleansing in terms of the population movement is something of a myth, but in terms of the land ownership,
that's right.
Absolutely is the case.
That's
and
right.
Whose policy is that?
Well, that's the policy of the people with a vested interest in it, which are the venture capitalists who've lent £1 million, and of course the soldiers who now want to be compensated for their service with Irish land. So the pressure groups are very great. So there's a tension which you can see throughout 1652 to 1654 between Cromwell saying the basis of our policy must be a set of rules which guarantee people who've received promises that their promises aren't broken, and we will only execute and force and compel into exile those who committed war crimes, against the policy of let's start the other end. Let's start with saying how much land do we need, and let's just take that amount of land. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the detail of this is lost because there were tribunals in the Midwest that were trying people for war crimes, and the records do not survive, and we don't know how many people were convicted. They were following English law, the trial forms, and that required 2 witnesses to every overt act of treason. That was not going to be very easy to find. You could use depositions of witnesses from 1641, which still had legal force, but even so, we don't know how many people are executed, but we do know that that because so many people opted to go into exile and so many people were exiled under the terms of surrender articles and so on, that the land was generated. But it's a tension between Cromwell's policy of starting from saying, let's see how much guilt there is, and then distribute the land we got to people who committed the offences which require us to confiscate their land. And the other people say, we need to get 50% of the land, otherwise we can't get our compensation.
It's almost a kind of following on from the Elizabethan policy, which is quite curious given the fact that Cromwell is quite Elizabethan in some of his other attitudes, isn't he? You know, he's following on from the plan, you know, the Elizabethan Jacobean land settlements where it's confiscated rebels' land, you know, that he's the one that's being reassigned to the sort of the settlers and so on.
It's important that he, there's a very important debate during the Protectorate between, as it were, the 2 points of view. There's a man called Vincent Gookin, who is the son of a leading legal official from an English official who'd gone over to be part of the legal establishment in the Jacobean period, and his son, who is always arguing that the Irish can be brought round. I mean, if we treat them decently, they will become respectable. I mean, you know, they might even convert. And they're hardline people, headed by an officer called Richard Lawrence, who interestingly was the man that Ireton had brought over to sort out the crisis of the Tories in Waterford, who thinks that he wants to go for ethnic cleansing. He wants to, and that debate in a series of pamphlets reflects the 2 sides of the policy, with Cromwell and his younger son Henry on one side of the debate, and Ireton having started it, particularly Charles Fleetwood and other parts of the very radical establishment who are pushing for ethnic cleansing. And that it takes a long... One of the problems for Cromwell is that he's appointed Fleetwood. Fleetwood is his son-in-law. He's married to his daughter Bridget.
Who'll previously been married to Ireton.
So he calls him to England, but he won't take away from him the position of Lord Deputy to which he'd been appointed. So Henry is sent to be de facto Governor of Ireland, but he's not given the title or full power. Now that is either, you know, incredibly clever and then not in showing that he's able to play them off against one another, or alternatively it's weakness, but he simply can't he can't make the really hard decision, which is to sack Fleetwood. And he doesn't sack Fleetwood because that might destabilise his control of the army. So because Henry Cromwell doesn't have any great purchase on the army, Fleetwood does. So it's an interesting question: should we judge him as lacking strength of will over these issues, or is he actually being very, 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 very canny? Because he does have the same problem, of course, over the kingship, when he could see all kinds of advantages in becoming king, but he can also see that he could fatally undermine the strength of support that he's got in the army, and in the end he definitely decides to resist taking the kingship. You can either do that at a calculating level, or you can do it at a level of, if God wanted to be king, he'd make the army support it, because God has always been spoken through the army. And I tend to think he's looking to see whether God does something which persuades all the army to back him, and he doesn't, of course.
Yeah.
So he doesn't take it. I think he probably could have got away with being king. I think there would have been a lot of grumbling, and might have been some resignations. But I don't think he would have been overthrown if he'd taken the kingship, and he would have got a lot more support from moderate gentry who want monarchy but don't necessarily want Stuart monarchy.
Yeah. In terms of, the detail in terms of the confiscation in Ireland, the level of detail I went into, obviously then you have things like the Down Survey, detailed mapping, which are these beautiful maps, but also then with a deeply sinister purpose to them.
They are. But they are incredible. They are incredibly good. If you put modern GIS mapping on top of these maps, they are incredibly accurate. There's all them extremely long ropes, measuring things with very long pieces of rope. But when you actually do put they're all available free, incidentally, on a Trinity College Dublin website. Put Down Survey into your search engine, you see all these incredible maps with incredible detail, but they are the basis of the redistribution. Of course, the redistribution was done by everybody who had a claim, everybody who's invested either their money in 1642, or of course their lives in the army. And they all went into two lotteries. The first lottery distributed the land by county, and then a second lottery, county by county, gave you the particular piece of land within the county in which you'd got your lot. So it was all done by a small boy pulling the names out of some kind of bucket.
The sinister version of the National Lottery, basically.
And God so will had turned out that the senior officers all seem to get prime land in
what a surprise! It was their reverse. Yes. Yeah. How should we look at this in terms of the kind of historiography of Cromwell in Ireland? In terms of, because it's really particularly during the late 19th century with the rise of the Irish nationalist movement, where he becomes the huge bogeyman, doesn't he, at that stage? Arguably prior to that, there doesn't seem to be quite so much of a murmur about it, arguably because we were doing equally as unpleasant things.
I think some recent work, particularly by Sarah Covington and by eminent, suggested that if we look at Irish sources rather than English language sources, we might get a slightly different view.
And Sarah Covington's books are excellent.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a folklore history which is much earlier than the. So I think now we'd say that the image of Cromwell as the demon, had got strong hold outside the English language speaking areas. But it's obviously it became a really serious issue. So by the late 19th century, the idea of a statue to Cromwell outside the House of Parliament was resisted first and foremost because of he killed the king, but also so there were some Tories who didn't want to have a statue of him because he killed the king, and there were some Liberals didn't want to have a statue to him because what he'd done in Ireland. And it's already by 1899 clear that he's a deeply contentious figure. And I found over my career that lecturing about Cromwell, you will probably get, if you go to a local history society, you know, I remember going once to Downham Market to a kind of lecture society which met every month. It was rather alarming because they'd say to you, there's no fee for giving these lectures. We take a collection at the end and the speaker gets about exactly half of what we take. On a good night, a speaker might get 80 quid. So, and they told you that before you lectured, and you waited to see, you know, what came at the end of the evening. But if you talk to that kind of group, you'd find it was probably 2/3, you know, pro and 1/3 anti. But if you talk to an American audience, you'd find it was the other way around at least. I mean, probably 80% anti and 20. I mean, the Irish view of Cromwell is absolutely predominant within America. And the only time I've been physically attacked was actually over remarks about Cromwell and Ireton in New York, when somebody stood up. I'd given a talk called Cromwell, Warts and All, one of the warts I talked about being Ireland, and this diminutive, quite an elderly lady got up and said, how to say anything good about that devil who'd wiped out all her ancestors in Monaghan? And rather ill-advisedly, I said, not all of them, surely.
Yes, there is a genealogical thing there, isn't there? Yeah.
And so I said no, and nobody laughed, of course. And I said, I'm sorry, that was facetious. I didn't mean that's what I mean is, actually, he never went to Monaghan. I said, I've no doubt whatsoever that your ancestors had a terrible time at the hands of the New Model Army. But when the New Model Army was attacking your ancestors in Monaghan, he was killing Presbyterians in Scotland. And at that point she lost it and attacked me with an umbrella. I mean, came at me with an umbrella and had to be restrained by elderly Jesuits because this was in a Jesuit university in New York at Fordham. And but there was one summer when I was teaching summer schools in Oxford for Saga, for the. And 1 week it would be English, and the next week it would be American, and I got that very strong feeling then. I was talking about Cromwell and Milton as 17th century Cambridge figures, because they were doing a study week on Cambridge. And the Americans will say, why are you bothering with Cromwell? We all want to hear about his Milton, because Cromwell was a bad man, and Milton is great. Whereas the English were really engaging, and even the people who said you've been too generous to Cromwell still were willing to engage. But the Americans rather sort of just dismiss him as being, you know, an awful man. And let's talk about Milton, who I think was an awful human being myself, but that's another story.
John, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you very much for giving us that brilliant overview of what is a hugely complex and undoubtedly will continue to be a hugely contentious subject.
That we can be sure about.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I hope you've enjoyed that. Hope you found that interesting. Please do remember to like and subscribe to this video. Of course, as always, we will be putting up other videos over the next few months on different aspects of Cromwell, the mid-17th century, the period of the Civil Wars. And as I say, we will have other videos, 1 or 2 which we recorded already, some others which we'll be recording in the next few months, with other experts looking particularly at this issue of Ireland as well. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you again soon.